In this lecture video, I'm going to be looking at Stoic Ethics, both from the early Greek accounts, as well as from some of the Roman thinkers like Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, Seneca, and so on. Before I begin with Stoicism, I need to briefly explain Cynicism, which is the precursor to the Stoic philosophical tradition. The Cynics thought that in order to live virtuously, this meant that one had to live in accordance with nature. By doing so, they often rejected social conventions, customs, traditions as being absurd, often ridiculing them. Instead, they say that they found the quickest path to virtue, to living a virtuous life, even though it's actually quite difficult, because they're literally rejecting social customs, attempting to live as they see other animals do. For them, ethics is conceived as a way of life. It's not some theoretical doctrine that needs to be expounded upon. Quite literally, ascesis, a Greek word meaning a kind of training of the self or practice, is fundamental to the Cynic conception of a virtuous life. And we have the chief example of Cynics in the most famous one, Diogenes of Sinope. Sinope was a region in northern Turkey on the coast there. His nickname was the dog. And Cynic, actually, kunikos, means dog-like. So Diogenes is often referred to Diogenes of Sinope or Diogenes the dog because he quite literally lived like a dog. And we can see in this famous painting here depicting Diogenes, he's living in a barrel. He supposedly found a barrel and decided that was all he needed for a home, was to live in that barrel. We also see him holding a lamp. There's a famous story where he is wandering the streets in Athens and he holds up his lamp and basically, people are like, why are you holding up a lamp? It's like, the middle of the day, the sun is out. And Diogenes basically responds saying, I'm looking for an honest man. So a critique of Athenian society and the people within it. So he's not necessarily the most liked person in Athens. A couple other stories. So he once supposedly was sunbathing, and Alexander the Great happens to come upon him and is like, wow, this is the famous Diogenes. I want you to teach me virtue. And Diogenes responds to, the most powerful man in the world at the time, Alexander the Great, telling him to get out of his sun. We also have a story of where he was actually in the marketplace and decided to masturbate. And when everyone else got upset at him for doing that, he said, I felt the urge. I relieved the urge. Why would it matter where there's a proper place to masturbate? Because anything that is acceptable to do in private should also be acceptable to do in public. So he denies that private-public distinction. And finally, one last story. Supposedly, Plato's giving some lecture on the nature of a human being and says that the definition of a human being is a featherless biped. And so Diogenes shows up with a plucked chicken, holds it up and says, behold, Plato's man. As a way to, again, ridicule Plato. There's quite a story of the way that Diogenes would often supposedly come to lectures and bring food, eat loudly, and things like that to just disturb the social custom, right, of attending a lecture and things like that. But what we want to see, though, is this Cynic way of life as trying to live the kind of, bare necessary life. Quite literally, Cynics would do things like try to test themselves by wearing as few clothing as possible, even when it's extremely cold outside, by trying to run through hot sand or things like that to test their body against the elements, to try to quite literally live in nature no matter what nature had to offer. The Stoics are quite different. Now, they come from the Cynics. They're influenced by the Cynics, but they are more disciplined, for lack of a better word. So for the Stoics, to live virtuously is to live in accordance with nature, just as was the case with the Cynics. But they develop philosophical doctrines, and they don't reject all of society's customs. A few things about what it means to live in accordance with nature, to live virtuously. So practice of virtue is both necessary and sufficient to achieve happiness. So we don't have to have full knowledge of some understanding of the theory of ethics or anything like that in order to achieve happiness. For the Cynics, they're opposed to Aristotle's virtue ethics because they think it's too aristocratic. Because, for example, in Aristotle's ethics, if one does not have certain privileges in life, then one cannot achieve eudaimonia. They can't, for example, practice the virtue of magnanimity. So in this regard, the Stoics try to strike a kind of middle ground between Aristotelian virtue ethics and the kind of brutish, for lack of a better term, ethics of the Cynics. Also, though, ethics for the Stoics, unlike Aristotle, is an exact science. While also, though, being similar to Aristotle, and then it's founded on the nature of the world. So it is a kind of natural law theory ethics. It is teleological. But we'll see a bit later the way in which ethics for the Stoics can be said to be an exact science, in that one can know beforehand what one ought to do to live virtuously, as opposed to Aristotle's more context-dependent approach. So, a few famous Stoic philosophers, although, of course, not limited to all of them. I mean, for example, in the picture I have here, Seneca, but we also have Zeno of Citium. So Citium is in the island of Cyprus. He lived around 336 to 265 BCE and was actually the founder of Stoicism. And we should not confuse this Zeno with the Zeno of Elea, who was often thought of more as a kind of sophist. This is a different Zeno. We also have Epictetus, lived 55 to 135 CE in Rome. And we have Marcus Aurelius, lived 121 to 180 CE, and who was a Roman emperor, quite literally a philosopher king. So beginning with the concepts of good and bad. For the Stoics, the idea of something just, the idea of goodness, is acquired naturally. And it's acquired naturally because it is an extension of what we find through self-preservation. And self-preservation, of course, exists in more than just human beings. It exists in all animals. The Stoics, observing natural behavior, how all animal species act, they see that animals are moved towards things which enable their self-preservation, right? They seek things that are good for them insofar as what is good extends their life. So just as animals do that as well, and they do that chiefly through desire, right? We desire towards things. It quite literally moves us to attain, to possess that thing, to grasp it. The idea is that so too do humans and the gods move towards the good and the just as the source of its movement. So we have a kind of teleological principle of motion occurring here. So they say, for passion is vicious and uncontrolled reason, which acquires vehemence and strength from bad and erroneous judgment. So on the one hand, desire is the first kind of seed where we can see and we can learn what good is and what is bad, because, well, we desire things that lead to our self-preservation. But sometimes desire can also lead us to do bad things, right? So it's on the virtuous individual, or to attain virtue. It's learning how to judge desires, when to assent to them, when to deny them, It's all about then, in that sense, controlling the passions, or knowing, right, what kind of passions arise, what they might mean, when to assent to them, when to not. So the good is envisaged as a general principle of order or harmony, right? Transcending the world. It encompasses the entire world, beyond just human beings. It's not something just that exists in some other immaterial realm. In fact, the Stoics deny that. But it not only transcends then the natural values of which we were previously aware through self-preservation, but it also then connects us with the general order of the world, the natural end, the natural purpose of existence. So rationality and the good, then, in that sense, the ability to use reason and the good coincide both for the Stoics in God, but it also coincides in human beings, only if, though, they perfect their reason, because it is only through the perfection of reason that we can fully grasp the logos, a divine logos in a sense, the rational order of the world. And for the Stoics, reason is rational. Nature is rational. So human beings are designed to fulfill this kind of good. The truly good, though, is something that we perceive by analogical reasoning from the value of such things according to nature, as, for example, bodily strength. And so, in turn, then, on the other hand, moral weakness is treated as a failure to see the good as it really is. So there's the connection here between knowledge of natural phenomena, knowledge of the things as they truly are, and ignorance of things as they truly are. In a different lecture video, I talk about Stoic epistemology, but we can already see here the connection between correct understanding or scientific knowledge and grasping moral goodness. So happiness is solely constituted by virtue for the Stoics. And so the idea is that virtue is choice-worthy for its own sake. We don't pursue virtue for some other end, but virtue is one and the same thing as happiness. Virtue is a rational consistency. It is the ability for one to correctly recognize things in the world and their causes for what they truly are. And so if one has rational consistency, reason, or how we assent to things, our motivations for pursuing goods that enable self-preservation, are not influenced in any way by any kind of irrational part of the soul, as would be the case, for example, in Aristotle's conception of the soul. So for the Stoics, the soul isn't divided into rational and irrational parts. It is just, when one is virtuous, it is just rational. It is reason alone that enables one to recognize virtue and pursue virtue and eventually act virtuously. Additionally, something different from Aristotle is that the Stoics say that whoever has one virtue has them all. It wouldn't be possible for one to, for example, act courageously, but then also not know how to act in moderation. Is where it could be the case in Aristotle's virtue ethics that one could develop an understanding of one kind of virtue and how to act courageously, but not fully understand moderation. For the Stoics, there is just acting virtuously, which means understanding how to act correctly in all facets of life, or there is ignorance of that entirely. They say that the virtues are inter-entailing, not only because he who has one has them all, but also because he who does any action in accordance with one does so in accordance with them all. Why? Because to act virtuously is to have scientific knowledge. It is to have true knowledge. There is also then no in-between virtue and vice in the way that you can have, with Aristotle's virtue ethics, to act virtuously is to act the mean in between two extremes. And sometimes, depending on the context, the mean can be a little bit closer to one extreme or another. The Stoics reject that idea entirely. So they say, yes, but just as in the sea, the man an arm's length from the surface is drowning no less than the one who has sunk 500 fathoms. So even those who are getting close to virtue are no less in a state of vice than those who are far from it. And just as the blind, even if they are going to recover their sight a little later, so those progressing remain foolish and vicious right up to their attainment of virtue. So to act virtuously depends on a correct understanding. It depends on the correct state of mind, correct judgment. And correct judgment involves true knowledge of the world as it is, and things as they are, as we perceive them, as we make sense of them, knowing how to judge them correctly. And from knowing how to judge them correctly, we know how to act. So I've already been speaking about how important it is for the Stoics, this idea of understanding the world correctly. So for the Stoics, determinism and moral responsibility presuppose each other. Now, typically, one thinks that, well, for there to be any kind of moral responsibility, there must be libertarian free will, where there is no such thing as fate. We fully determine all of our actions, and that is why what we do is so important, because we bear full responsibility for them. But the Stoics say that actually doesn't make sense at all. That for them, the only reason we can have moral responsibility is to understand how our actions affect others, to see the kind of causal chain of events and what our role is in the unfolding of those events. So a person's moral character is the primary cause of their performing good or bad acts. One doesn't just act perfectly virtuously because they will themselves to do so. They have to build a character, right? It depends on all kinds of causal factors making possible virtuous behavior. And one only knows how to act virtuously because of all the work and the practice and the effort that has gone into it beforehand. Fate is the moral structure of the world because they see the world, as I said, as fated, as determined through cause and effect. And so what is required then in ethics is a proper system for apportioning responsibility between relevant causal factors. So for actions to be in our power, even to say that the world is fated, we can still say actions are in our power simply because we are their principal cause, right? When I reach for this lemonade, the lemonade, going down my throat and into my body, I'm the principal cause of the lemonade, being ingested. So fate can be said to bring these actions out through us, but we can still be considered or determined to be their principal cause. And so when we act badly, when we do things that lead to harmful consequences, then we can say, I am morally responsible for those actions because I was the principal cause in the chain of events that led to perhaps that bad action. Or maybe I need to be praised because, again, I was the principal cause in those chain of events that led to whatever that good thing was that we praise. So I also just want to mention, right, moral responsibility stems solely from the distinction between praiseworthiness and blameworthiness. So we don't say that there are good actions because there's something inherent in what we do. It's based on the mark of our actions and the effects that they lead in the world outward from ourselves. And so we can say then whether one is praiseworthy or blameworthy. And that's where moral responsibility stems from. If one is incapable of being blameworthy or praiseworthy, then we cannot say that there is any ethical behavior in that action, or it can be judged in an ethical way. So a few things to look at as to how they explain why there can be moral responsibility if the world is fated. So why deliberate and make decisions at all if our actions will ensue regardless, which is, to say what would be the case if the world is fated. So they say, just as if you push a stone cylinder on steeply sloping ground, you've produced the cause and beginning of its forward motion. But soon as it rolls forward, not because you are still making it to do so, but because such are its form and smooth rolling shape, so too the order, rationale, and necessity of fate sets in motion the actual types of causes and their beginnings. But the deliberative impulses of our minds and our actual actions are controlled by our own individual will and intellect. They say that the cloak should not perish was fated, not absolutely, but together with its being looked after. Someone's escaping from the enemy was fated with his running away from the enemy. And having children was fated together with wanting to have intercourse with a woman. So in all these cases, right, we only say something was fated because of the effect it produced, always in response to the cause. So let me look at this longer argument on page 391. So the Stoics say, for it is not the case that while fate is of this kind, destiny does not exist, nor that while destiny exists, apportionment does not, nor that while apportionment exists, retribution does not, nor that while retribution exists, law does not, nor that while law exists, there does not exist right reason enjoining what must be done and prohibiting what must not be done. But it is wrong actions that are prohibited and right actions that are enjoined. Therefore, it is not the case that while fate is of this kind, wrong and right action do not exist. But if wrong and right actions exist, so do virtue and vice. If these exist, so do rectitude and turpitude. But rectitude is commendable and turpitude is reprehensible. Therefore, it is not the case that while fate is of such a kind, commendable and reprehensible do not exist. But commendable things deserve honor, and reprehensible things deserve punishment. Therefore, it is not the case that while fate is of this kind, honor and punishment do not exist. But honor is the bestowal of privilege, and punishment is correction. Therefore, it is not the case that while fate is of this kind, the bestowal of privilege and correction do not exist. But if this is so, all the things mentioned remain, even if all things come about in accordance with fate. Right and wrong actions, honors, punishments, bestowals of privilege, commendations, and censures. So, why punish someone if we say, well, their action was fated? It was determined that they would act in such and such a way. And so their action, therefore, needs to be punished. And the Stoics basically say, well, we say that even though the world is fated, an action can be, someone should be punished if the action is blameworthy. And why? Because it doesn't make sense to call something blameworthy if, it doesn't make sense to punish someone if we don't say their action is blameworthy. Because the concepts praiseworthy and blameworthy correspond to punishment and praise. Now, why again? Why would you say an action is blameworthy? Well, just in the same way that we would say that a car, okay, you're driving down the road and someone tries to hit the brakes, and it just so happens that the brakes fail, and so they run into, I don't know, like the side of a building. We would still blame some causal factor in why that car ran into the side of the building. Now, in this case, the principal actor would be the brakes, or the mechanism around which the brakes then failed. It is the failure of the brakes to act as they are intended to do so that caused the wreck. Now, the difference is brakes cannot learn from their decisions. They cannot learn in the sense of how to judge what happened or how to make sense of it, how to deal with their passions, because brakes don't have any of those things. Only human beings have that capacity through the use of reason to reflect on our actions. So for the Stoics, it's all about how to interpret, how to make sense of the actions of the world. So the main argument for the Stoics is that moral goodness largely consists in living willingly and to the best of your ability the life assigned to you by fate. So if instead you resent your ill fortune, you remain powerless to avert it. And by standing against the plans of providence, you become morally bad. Now, this doesn't mean that they say, let's say confronted with injustice, they would just say, well, we just need to accept that there's going to be this kind of an injustice and we do nothing about it. They would say, if you can do something about it, then you ought to, right? That's the mark of a virtuous person, to do something to try and address an injustice. The difference, the Stoics are saying, is if you can do nothing about that injustice, if through your actions you can't influence its overcoming, then you should not feel bad. You shouldn't punish yourself. You should not think in such a way that it is your fault, because it is not your fault. So the Stoics often get blamed. They're often praised by like Silicon Valley types who basically say like, oh, I'm really interested in Stoicism because I can manage my feelings, I can manage my passions, and so I'm basically just emotionless to the things in the world. That's not the case at all. The Stoics are not actually emotionless. They are the most in touch with their emotions. They are the most in touch with their feelings. The difference is they know how to control their feelings. They know how to interpret their feelings. And they know then how to judge to what extent, according to whether good things or bad things happen in the world, what their role is in those things occurring. So virtues then are final as well as instrumental goods. So it's not just the case that we pursue virtue in order to achieve eudaimonia, a life well lived, but it is that through the pursuit of virtue and in achieving virtue, we also achieve happiness. So virtues are both the means for attaining happiness and the excellencies of which it consists. It is the perfection of reason and the end of human nature. Now, the Stoic sage, the wise man, is said to not be able to be disturbed or suffer if they are then truly virtuous and therefore happy. Why? Well, they say that it's a peculiar characteristic of the wise man that he does nothing which he could regret, nothing against his will, but does everything honorably, consistently, seriously, and rightly. That he anticipates nothing as if it were bound to happen, is shocked by nothing when it does happen, under the impression that its happening is unexpected and strange, refers everything to his own judgment, and stands by his own decisions. It necessarily follows that the happy life is in the power of the man who has the final good in his power. So the wise man's life is always happy. So again, we can see here the mark of the sage is in their mental capacity to understand their position in the circumstances of the world, to understand that the world is fated, to not be surprised when surprising things happen, because they're not going to be surprised that unexpected things occur. They know that sometimes unexpected things occur, and they've learned from past experiences how to deal with those emotions or impressions. So at this point, I want to turn to Epictetus Handbook to see ways in which the later Roman Stoics tried to guide others to act virtuously. There's a way in which they, to some extent, are less political in that there is politics. I mean, the early Greek Stoics are cosmopolitans. But the later Roman Stoics, they are more about self-cultivation. And that's not to say the early Greek Stoics weren't about self-cultivation either. But there's a way in which, as we can see, I think, in reading Epictetus Handbook, there's a kind of early version of like the self-help book. Now, this can, of course, be good. Anybody can profit from this. But there's a way in which we should be aware as well of the kind of political assumptions it might entail. So, for Epictetus, Philosophy is a way of life, right? It's not just a theoretical discipline, as was the case with all of the earlier Greek Stoics. But he wants to show that, in fact, virtue is teachable. Because it wouldn't be teachable if we didn't have other people that become virtuous. So, the first section of the handbook, Epictetus writes, "Some things are within our power, while others are not. Within our power are opinion, motivation, desire, aversion, and, in a word, whatever is of our own doing. Not within our power are our body, our property, reputation, office, and, in a word, whatever is not of our own doing. So remember then, that if you regard that which is by nature slavish as being free, and that which is not your own as being your own, you'll have cause to lament. You'll have a troubled mind, and you'll find fault with both gods and human beings. But if you regard only that which is your own as being your own, and that which isn't your own as not being your own, as indeed is actually the case of the world, no one will ever be able to coerce you. No one will hinder you. You'll find fault with no one. You'll accuse no one. You'll do nothing whatever against your will. You'll have no enemy, and no one will ever harm you, because no harm can affect you." So I want to read a couple more sections. "With regard to everything that is a source of delight to you, or is useful to you, or of which you are fond, remember to keep telling yourself what kind of thing it is, starting with the most insignificant. If you're fond of a jug, say, 'This is a jug that I'm fond of,' and then if it gets broken, you won't be upset. If you kiss your child or your wife, say to yourself that it is a human being that you're kissing, and then if one of them should die, you won't be upset." Number 4. "When you're about to embark on any action, remind yourself what kind of action it is. If you're going out to take a bath, set before your mind the things that happen at the baths. That people splash you, that people knock up against you, that people steal from you. And you'll thus undertake the action in a surer manner if you say to yourself at the outset, 'I want to take a bath and ensure at the same time that my choice remains in harmony with nature.' And follow the same course in every action that you embark on. So if anything gets in your way while you're taking your bath, you'll be ready to tell yourself, 'Well, this wasn't the only thing that I wanted to do, but I also wanted to keep my choice in harmony with nature, and I won't keep it so if I get annoyed at what is happening.'" So we can already kind of see the way that the Stoics, and especially if you read Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, you can see the way in which they quite literally keep a diary of their feelings. They document every passion that they feel. They learn from them through this way, through contemplating, through recollecting their experiences and how they feel, what they did, how they acted in those experiences, to always learn from them. So number 5, "It isn't the things themselves that disturb people, but the judgments that they form about them. Death, for instance, is nothing terrible, or else it would have seemed so to Socrates too. No, it is in the judgment that death is terrible that the terror lies. So accordingly, whenever we are impeded, disturbed, or distressed, we should never blame anyone else, but only ourselves, that is to say, our judgments. It is the act of an ill-educated person to cast blame on others when things are going badly for him. One who has taken the first steps towards becoming properly educated casts blame on himself, while one who is fully educated casts blame neither on another nor on himself." And I just want to note, we can, going back to 4 real quick, when Epictetus writes, "When you're about to embark on any action, remind yourself what kind of action it is." So basically, you're not surprised when you know, okay, some people splash you and things like that happen in the bath. We can think of all kinds of other circumstances, like road rage, right? So before I drive, I think to myself, some people act like idiots when they drive. So I should be prepared that there's going to likely be that kind of behavior on the road when I'm driving. And that way I can, over time, prevent myself from getting enraged while I drive, but learn to accept the kind of behavior that others engage in. right? So it's no use of me getting upset about, the way that others drive and saying, people should be better, etc., if I can't actually, especially in that moment, make people better. It is no use to me to get upset because I'm the only one that's feeling that anger. I'm the only one that's feeling those emotions. I'm the only one that's feeling negatively. Those other people that are doing that, they're not feeling those emotions. So it does no use to me or to them for me to get enraged in those kinds of moments. Okay, so let's move on to 8. Don't seek that all that comes about should come about as you wish, but wish that everything that comes about should come about just as it does, and then you'll have a calm and happy life. 12.1. If you want to make progress, reject such things as these. If I neglect my affairs, I'll have nothing to live on. Or, if I don't punish my slave boy, he'll turn out badly. For it is better to die of hunger, but free from distress and fear, than to live in plenty with a troubled mind. And it is better that your slave should be bad than that you should be unhappy. So make a start then with small things. So a drop of oil is spilled, a little wine is stolen. Say to yourself, such is the price at which equanimity is bought. Such is the price that one pays for peace of mind. For nothing can be acquired at no cost at all. When you summon your slave boy, keep in mind that he may not obey, and even if he does, he may not do what you want, but he is hardly so well placed that it depends on him whether you are to enjoy peace of mind. All right, 14. If you want your children and wife and friends to live forever, you're a fool, because you're wanting things that aren't within your power to be within your power, and things that aren't your own to be your own. And likewise, if you want your slave boy never to commit a fault, you're an idiot, because you're wanting badness not to be badness, but something else. If you make it your wish, however, not to fail in your desires, that lies within your power. So exercise yourself in that which you can achieve. Everyone is subject to anyone who has power over what he wants or doesn't want, as one who is in a position to confer it or take it away. If anyone wants to be free, then let him neither want anything nor seek to avoid anything that is under the control of others, or else he is bound to be a slave. All right, 16. When you see someone weeping in sorrow because his child has gone away, or because he has lost his possessions, take care that you're not carried away by the impression that he is indeed in misfortune because of these external things. But be ready at once with this thought. It isn't what has happened that so distresses this person. For someone else could suffer the same without feeling that distress, but rather the judgment he has formed about it. As far as words go, however, don't hesitate to sympathize with him, or even, if the occasion rises, to join in his lamentations. But take care that you don't also lament deep inside. So there's something really interesting here, right? There's the passage about, if you want your children and wife and friends to live forever, you're a fool, because you should know they're human beings and human beings die. Now, of course, that doesn't mean we don't feel upset about that we can't love them, but we shouldn't be surprised. We should practice about how to handle it when that moment inevitably comes. And likewise, when someone dies who was close to a friend of yours, you don't just say to your friend, well, of course that the person was going to die, you shouldn't act this way. No, Epictetus is saying, right, you should console them. You should be there with them. You should know how to be what it means to be a friend to them. But interestingly, again, I'll read this last line. But take care that you don't also lament deep inside. Right? In that sense, then you are fully in control of your emotions. You're fully in control of your actions. Okay, 17. Remember that you're an actor in a play, which will be as the author chooses, short if he wants it to be short, and long if he wants it to be long. If you want you to play the part of a beggar, act even that part with all your skill. And likewise, if you're playing a cripple, an official, or a private citizen, for that is your business, to act the role that is assigned to you as well as you can. But it is another's part to select that role. Let's move to 28. If someone handed over your body to somebody whom you encountered, you'd be furious. But that you hand over your mind to anyone who comes along, so that if he abuses you, it becomes disturbed and confused. Do you feel no shame at that? Right? Think back to the example of the road rage incident. When you get upset because of how someone else is driving, right? Epictetus is saying you're basically allowing your mind to be abused by others. You've given up control of your own mind to someone else. 33. Specifically 33.9. Yeah. If someone reports to you that a certain person is speaking ill of you, don't defend yourself against what has been said, but reply instead, "Ah, yes, he was plainly unaware of all my other faults, or else those wouldn't have been the only ones that he mentioned." 35. When you've decided that you ought to do something and are doing it, never try to avoid being seen to do it, even if most people will probably view it with disapproval. For if it isn't right to do, avoid doing it in the first place. But if it is, why be afraid of those who will reproach you without justification? 44. The following assertions don't form a coherent argument. I'm richer than you, therefore I'm better than you. Or, I'm more eloquent than you, therefore I'm better than you. No, it is these that do. I'm richer than you, therefore my possessions are superior to yours. Or, I'm more eloquent than you, therefore my way of speaking is superior to yours. But you yourself are neither your possessions nor your way of speaking. 48.1. The condition and character of a layman is this, that he never expects that benefit or harm will come to him from himself, but only from externals. But the condition and character of a philosopher is this, that he expects all benefit and harm to come to him from himself. All right, so we can see the way that the Stoics are prioritizing mastery of one's own self, mastery of one's own mind. And that is how one achieves happiness. That is how one lives virtuously. So lastly, 51.1. How much longer will you delay before you think yourself worthy of what is best, and transgress in nothing the distinctions that reason imposes? You've acquired knowledge of the philosophical principles that you ought to accept, and you have accepted them. What kind of teacher, then, are you still waiting for, that you should delay any effort to reform yourself until he appears? You're no longer a youth. You're a full-grown man. If you're now negligent and idle, and are constantly making one delay after another, and setting one day and then another as the date after which you'll devote proper attention to yourself, then you'll fail to appreciate that you're making no progress, but will continue to be a layman your whole life through until you die. So what are you waiting for, right? Begin with the small things. Take note of your emotions. Take note of how you experience things and learn from them to never be surprised again from how the world unfolds.